Alright, today on Off Topic Tuesday is going to be taking a look at the Chaos Demons and what I think will be their launch races, that being Chaos Undivided for the Chaos Demons. So you know how I always start these videos with saying kick back, grab a drink, and let's get into it? Well, this is going to be a pretty damn long video, so really get comfortable, grab yourself a nice big glass of milk, and let's get started.
Wow.
Alright, so we'll start out by sort of going over our two options. I've done this in a bunch of other Chaos videos, but in case this is your first one, there's essentially two big options for doing Demons of Chaos. One is the combined monogods option. If you ever watch Milk and Cookies Total Warhammer, this is the one they often go with. In this one, you would take your Warriors of Chaos, your Norska, and your Demons of Chaos, and just smush them all together to create one individual monogod for each. So you'd have a Coronate faction that would have your, berserkers and your bloodletters and all of your mortal and demon people put into one faction under the faction name of Khorne. The other option is to do a standard Demons of Chaos faction, which would be undivided, and then down the road you would essentially do monogod packs that would affect all of the chaotic factions, including Norska, Beastmen, and Warriors of Chaos, in addition to the Demons of Chaos. Now, there's pros and cons for each of them. The pros on the combined one being pretty obvious, right? I mean, Milk and Cookies brings it up in their video, and even if it's just common sense, it's easy, right? The the lower the cost of entry for CA to make these things, the higher the chances that they do get created, right? So by making easier factions, the chances of you actually seeing a Coronate faction, the chances of you seeing a Nurglish, a Slaaneshi, a Sintian, they all get better odds simply through the fact that they are easier to do. Downsides are also kind of obvious in this one too. You wouldn't really get a crazy amount of faction variety. Ultimately, the Coronate, the Tsinchian, the Nurglish, and the Slaaneshi factions would all kind of feel like reskins of one another, given that they're all kind of just sharing the themes between each other. They're essentially stealing half their rosters from the pre-existing Warriors of Chaos. So they wouldn't feel, you know, particularly interesting from there. There's also a couple other ones that people might not have considered with these. You get a lot less legendary lord options if you're only doing, a Coronate faction. You're not going to see a crap load of legendary lords until perhaps way later down the game when they're just doing legendary lord packs this way. But the one that really, really takes it on the nose and the one that would depress me big time would be what it would do to the Beastmen, right? There are some really cool monogod themed Beastmen options out there, but they go out the window the second you go this route. I mean, the Beastmen are not going to be combined into the Demons of Chaos roster. It's just not happening. So, you're giving up some to make things easier. Another way to do it would be to do the Demons of Chaos as their own unique faction that starts out undivided, the same way as the other three chaotic factions have. Again, some pros and cons for each of these, right? The nice thing about doing it this way is you can make the Chaos Demons a distinctly unique faction from Warriors of Chaos, from Norska, from the Beastmen, right? You can definitely tailor them in a way that you can't if you're taking half your roster from a pre-existing one. And the other two things that we just brought up just a second ago also become pros in this column, right? The chances of you seeing more unique Beastmen content go up as a direct result of getting legendary lord options going out for them. You're going to see more legendary lord options for them down the road just by the very nature of things. And then, of course, what we just said as pros for the first one become cons for this one, right? It's a boatload of work. I mean, chances are this would push any lord pack prices up quite substantially, probably all the way up to faction prices, because they would have to do 4 legendary lords, which is quite a bit on its own, but then also a ton of unique units for each of these. So that's sort of the downside to it. The other one, if you're concerned about, is that realistically, you'd probably only see Chaos Demons Undivided for a good chunk of the opening gameplay or for the opening release schedule. Like I said, the more work that it is to do, the slower that release content's going to be. It's just the nature of how work is, right? So I'm going to operate under the assumption that CA does this in the latter method, simply because A, I think it'll aggravate less people not having their monogod be ignored at launch. B, it's the way they've done it on all the other Chaos factions. And C, to me, it just makes the most sense long term for the health of the game. So like I said, we're going to operate under the assumption that that's how it's done. So if Chaos Demons Undivided are the launch race, then the question becomes, who are their legendary lords? First one's pretty obvious. We've all seen it tons of times in my videos and others' videos, I'm sure. That's Be'lakor, the Dark Master. He is essentially always the bridesmaid, never the bride. He always wanted to be the ever chosen, never could get picked as ever chosen, never would get picked as ever chosen, and he became really spiteful towards the Chaos Gods and was turned into a demon prince of Chaos Undivided as a result. Not only is that story really cool from the gameplay perspective, you would essentially have a Chaos demon who is at war with Chaos, which would be a really fun mechanic. But also B, it gives him really cool inspirations, right? You could basically always be at war with Be'lakor, and it is always justifiable. Your own factions basically toy with you, so you're always at war with them out of vengeance. The rest of the world sees you as a chaos demon, justifiably so. You're going to be at war with them. He has a ton of lore. He's got a ton of, justifications for everything. So I think Be'lakor is almost assuredly in the game, which leaves option two. Now, they're a bit harder of a swing because a lot of the lore for Undivided stuff or something outside of the four monogods is harder to come by in the modern lore. But I would probably go with Zuvassin. So, Zuvassin, for those of you who aren't aware, is essentially a chaos demon whose sole task it is in life is to screw around with other chaos factions. Kind of like Be'lakor, Zuvassin would be constantly getting into conflicts with other Chaos factions, which would be extremely fun. He's actually listed in the lore as a renegade god, which I also think could be pretty interesting to use. The nice thing about him too is that Zuvassin hasn't really been brought up for a long, long time by Games Workshop themselves, so CA would have quite a lot of leeway with how they want to play around with things. But again, they're not part of the Monogods faction, so to have all their stuff be undivided would be extremely easy. Now, the downside to these two factions, or these two options, I should say, is what to do about unit rosters. So in the Be'lakor case, I did say that there is the possibility of doing Dark Emissaries, and I still think that that holds true. But if we want to make things distinctly Chaos Demon based, having a bunch of, barbarians and dark emissaries and stuff running around for Zuvassin doesn't actually make sense. So I'll work on how to flesh out Zuvassin specifically further into this video. But before we get into Zuvassin, let's go ahead and wrap things up with Be'lakor. So I've spoken in my previous video in Albion about, what Be'lakor's unit roster and stuff would probably look like. But what about how he would actually play as a faction? So first things first, I think the Demons of Chaos in general should be focused on spreading chaos corruption throughout the world. It sounds simple enough, right? But in a way that actually gives them a sort of vortex objective. Basically, they should be aiming to do what they actually did in the end times, which is essentially drown this world in chaos and wipe it all out. So for the two Chaos Undivided factions, that actually is a super, super simple objective for them. They both believe that basically they are gods unto themselves. I mean, in the latter case, he actually is a god unto himself. So for them to be the ones to wipe out the world means like they're sort of playing their part in the great game. With Be'lakor specifically, his objectives would probably be taking out the Ever-Chosen, because that's always what he's wanted to be, and then ascending into a chaos god himself, which basically became Bellacor's purpose in life after the other chaos gods snubbed him. For unique things, Be'lakor would probably have the Dark Emissaries, like I said, which would be, mortal caster lords of some sort or another, or caster heroes, however they want to manage it, that's fine. Whereas Zuvassin would just be all chaos, so that would be one thing that would help separate Be'lakor into his own kind of unique role. Um, for gameplay focus, I think that they'd still probably have a pretty similar thing. As much as I did give a ton of Albion options to Be'lakor, the only other one I'd really, really want to see for him is potentially the Fimir and the Fen Beasts from Albion. Too much mortal stuff, and he's gonna kind of feel like just another Warriors of Chaos faction, which would kind of be a depressing result for him to me. If Be'lakor is the easy one, that makes Zuvassin the hard one. One thing I would do is perhaps kind of steal a little bit from Malal, which I know GW is pretty adamant about pretending it doesn't exist anymore because it's something that they can't monetize the ever-loving crap out of. But there's a lot of really good units and ideas and stuff within Malal's lore. I would essentially just kind of slyly blend that into Zuvassin and pretend like it was always the case. Um, for focus, like a campaign focus, Zuvassin would basically just want to kill every other Chaos faction. That's kind of their thing. While they are already a Chaos god, they are nowhere near the same power level as the four monogods. So for him, I could see the faction focus actually being just getting enough power, kind of like Be'lakor, to ascend into proper godhood. Um, to separate him out from Be'lakor, obviously you would not have Fenbeast, Femir, and Dark Emissaries. Instead, like I said, I would steal a little bit from the forces of Malal and give them kind of unique, like greater demons, so that they can have their own sort of unique spin on things. But that's enough about separating them out. So let's talk about the sort of shared general rosters that you'd expect to see. And I guess the easiest place to start with is the most relatable category, which is your standard infantry options. Now, there's a ton of different options and a ton of different variants and stuff, and I'm not going to get into all the little nitpicky different variants and stuff. But one thing I will say before we start is I am going to be taking some of this from the Forces of Malal, which I'll have a link to down in the description. Again, I think GW and CA would be very unwise not to find some utility out of the things that were come up with in here, because this is some of the most interesting looking units that has ever been created for GW. Starting out with them, you could have an old version of the Sons of Malice. The Sons of Malice are a 40k unit. They're essentially your standard Space Marines, or Chaos Space Marines, I suppose. You know, take them back down to Warhammer Fantasy, give them some sweet swords and what have you, make them a sort of better infantry unit. Your very higher end infantry unit without actually going up into the elite stuff would be your doomed ones. These are Sons of Malice who had essentially have become so impressive that they're actually blessed a little bit by their patron god. Your weakest of your weak would be imps. Yes, imps are in the lore for Warhammer. They are essentially super weak, undivided emotions. Now, they would effectively be tar pit units, but they would make for a very interesting tar pit unit because they are essentially flying units as well. So for a tier one weak unit, they would definitely have some unique things going for them. Also going down the scales would be the possessed and the null knights. Now the possessed would be pretty uninteresting overall. They're essentially just better mortals. I do think that they need to be in there just to give the chaos faction just a couple non-demonic units, for the simple reason that if we're assuming that all of the demon units are, essentially capable of crumbling like what necromantic units are, then I think that having a couple units that fall outside of that scope would be kind of interesting from a gameplay mechanic, right? You would have some units that actually turn tail and run as opposed to just disappearing outright, which would be super handy for the early game too in a campaign, right? You don't want to have your weak units constantly disappearing into a puff of smoke. It becomes very frustrating after a while, which would cause us to finish on the Null Knights. These would be one of the few interesting mortal options in their roster because, again, I wouldn't want to go too crazy with mortal options in there. But Null Knights would essentially be so incredibly blessed by Zuvassin that they have an anti-chaos aura about them. The way that you represent this in game is that they essentially just screw up the winds of magic wherever they are present, right? You can make this into a very good anti mage unit, right? In terms of actual mechanics and stuff, well, it'd probably just be a simple axe infantry or sword infantry or what have you. But yeah, their big claim to fame would be with screwing with your ability or screwing with your opponent's abilities to launch spells at you. On the same front, I would also give them a decent magic resist, not exceptionally crazy magic resist or anything, but good enough to make your opponent really question about what they're going to do if they've gone into a magic heavy army. Staying down, you would have dog options, of course, down near tier 1 and 2. Options here are pretty obvious, of course. You would have your normal Chaos Hounds, as well as Chaos Beasts, which would essentially be bigger, tougher Chaos Hounds to the point where they're starting to knock on the size of cavalry units. Not really too much interesting to go on here. You guys have already seen Chaos Hounds; they are already in the game, and Chaos Beasts would just be bigger, badder versions of them, essentially. For your more elite infantry options, I would steal all three of them from other sources. So the first one that I would steal would be Mardog. He is essentially he looks like the Grim Reaper. He used to be part of the lore for Khorne. He was a greater demon of them, but has since been abandoned and, of course, replaced out by Khorne's own greater demons. But as a result, that leaves him available as a potential unit option now. I would not make him into a greater demon equivalent, and I'll get into why when we get down into that section. But that's not to say you couldn't use them as like a tier 4 or 5 infantry. They'd probably cause terror given that they literally look like the embodiment of death. They would be dramatically powerful. I mean, these things are essentially powerful, powerful demons. You probably have a very limited number of them in a squad, probably like 12 or less. And they would, you know, probably be quite expensive as a result of that too, but they'd be a very interesting option to throw in for them. All right, continuing with our theme of stealing, we are going to steal from Warhammer 40k next with the Demon Brutes. So if the Mardag is a tier 5 infantry unit, these guys I guess would be tier 4. Looking at the pictures of you, I'm sure some of you are screaming that they would probably be monstrous infantry, not infantry, and that's fair, but see, I could always skinny them up ever so slightly and then put them in as a standard high tier infantry unit. I think that'd be a bit more interesting because Chaos Demons are swarming in beast options that we'll touch on later. Not really anything crazy special about these guys, right? They would just be big old guys swinging heavy hammers. Pretty simple unit to use. And the last infantry or elite infantry unit we will steal is being stolen from Malal, that being the Hook Horrors. Once again, definitely towing the line between monstrous and infantry. Just tilt them into infantry because, like I said, we have more monstrous units that we can ever possibly use. Again, would be pretty simple. You'd give them cause terror, or at least cause fear. You'd have them be damage dealers. These would not be the guys you would throw in for, long-term engagements or to tar pit or anything like that. These would be the ones you throw in when the enemy's back is turned fighting something else. All right, so that kind of wraps it up for all of the bipedal standard infantry options. Now we get into the fun stuff. So let's start this one out with flying beasts. There's quite a few of these available actually for Chaos Demons. Um, Two of them I'm really, really good with. The third one I could have no problems with them eliminating. These being Furies, Shrikes, and then potentially Chaos Dragons. Chaos Dragons is kind of a hit or miss one to me. They already exist in other rosters. I'm not too fond about having too much stuff copied and pasted from other rosters. But the Furies and the Shrikes should definitely be in there. So the first of these, the Furies, you've already seen them in game. We're not going to get too far into them, but they definitely, definitely belong in the Chaos Demons Undivided roster because that is exactly what they are. They are Demons of Chaos Undivided. But like I said, they would be basically a copy paste to go into this roster. The second one, the one that's more interesting, would be the Demon Shrike. Now, these can take on a few different forms, but basically they are always huge winged beasts. They would be, basically like a late game dragon equivalent. And I say dragon equivalent, they actually look like chaos dragons in some cases. So like they completely and totally supersede that role to me, which is why I said I'm not particularly crazy about throwing the chaos dragons into this roster. Sometimes they can appear with wings of bats or feathered wings and stuff. I don't really care how they look. They would essentially play like a chaos dragon, except for you just wouldn't have a noxious breath attack. You would just have, well, a chaos demon instead. So we'll move back down the scale slightly, probably to tiers 3 or maybe 4, down to the Mutileth Vortex Beasts. A lot of people associate these with Siege, and makes a lot of sense. They are all about magical energy, and they look vaguely Siegean, but they are actually an undivided unit. So, of course, that being the case, throw them into the Chaos Undivided roster. There's a few ways they could put them into the game. You could basically turn them into the artillery platform for the Chaos Demons. You could make them into an almost kind of monstrous cavalry. Myself, I would basically have them have an aura unit or be like an aura style unit. So a unit that's pretty powerful in close quarters combat, but also boosts all of his friendlies nearby to maybe giving them magic damage or something else. However, CA wants to play with it, there's so many good options with this unit, and they look absolutely amazing too. All right, these next couple ones are a wee bit controversial, but I'll bring them up anyway. These being Soul Grinders and Behemoths. So we'll start with the Soul Grinders. This is a unit that was literally copy pasted from Warhammer 40k back to Warhammer Fantasy. It is a undivided unit. although when Games Workshop did sort of copy paste them into fantasy, the aesthetic didn't really fit. They definitely look like a 40k unit more so than a fantasy one. CA could always tweak around the visuals and stuff and fix what GW should have done the first time around. But again, this could be a fun unit depending on how it's implemented. They could make it an artillery platform for the Chaos Demons, something that is lacking in their roster, or just have it operate as a mixture of a ranged unit and a sort of giant-esque beast unit. That's one controversial unit down. On to the next one. These being the Chaos Demon Behemoths. These are a 40k unit. They are Titan scale, so for reference's sake, that would put them at larger than even the Dread Zorian. Obviously, they'd have to be leashed back in for scale pretty dramatically. That would just be excessively large to the point of unusable. But again, it'd be kind of a fun option to have on the table. This would be distinctly tier 5, and even amongst the already incredibly powerful Chaos Demons, would likely be at the top end of their scale in terms of power. Um, the only issue with these ones is there's no official GW artwork. However, I mean, it's a giant friggin' demon. Probably not the hardest thing in the world for CA to come up with a design for. Only issue I could maybe see is that it would kind of sort of be filling the same role as what the greater demons would be for the chaos demons, but bit of a separate issue, and we can get into those conflicts later. All right, moving on to cavalry next. There's really only two big options in the lore, these being the Doom Riders and the Parasite Riders. Myself, I would separate them down by which mount they're riding. So the Parasite Riders I would have on the Limbo Ticks. Limbo Ticks, for what it's worth, are super quick little six-legged freaks. They are terrifying to look at, but they're essentially immune to poison. They're, like I said, ridiculously fast, faster than actually most horses are. And they would be the kind of lighter version of the two cavalries. The other one, the Nightmares, would represent your kind of heavier cavalry. These would be for the Doom Hunters, which would be a higher tier than what the Parasite Riders would be. These ones would probably be still anti-infantry. I think both of these would be anti-infantry. But the Doom Riders would probably have an anti-magical aura about them, or a weapon that does increase damage to demons if possible, or, some method of basically making them an absolute nightmare for other chaos demons and mages to deal with. One last option in the beast before we wrap up, and that's mostly because I didn't figure out where else to put them into this list, but these would be the paradoxes. Again, these are stolen from Malal's list, full disclosure, but they look incredible. They have huge scything arms. They eat things. They're psychotic looking designs. I think that honestly, out of every Chaos faction, Malal has by far the most interesting designs to steal from. Um, these are almost to the point where you could use them as kind of a monstrous cavalry unit if you threw some units up on top of it. Or alternatively, you could just lead them in as a super fast, almost like super dog style of unit. Super dogs. Um, Again, I couldn't really figure out where to put them in the list, but they're another amazing option to keep in there. So at the hero level would be one of the first times where I'd actually kind of separate the rosters back out again, with, like I said, with the exception of the Fimir and Fen Beasts. For the heroes for Zuvassin, I would have the Heralds, Dark Magisters, and Exalted Demons. Heralds would be kind of your support hero option. They wouldn't be particularly powerful in combat and stuff like that, but you could use them to really prop up the rest of your units. Dark Magisters would, of course, be spellcasters, and Exalted Demons would be your dedicated melee unit. The exception that I would make would be for Bellicor. I would swap out Dark Magisters for Dark Emissaries. I know I said earlier whether or not I could consider them a lord. Looking at the list, I think they make more sense as a hero option. And you can essentially just give them some bonuses over Dark Magisters, like unique mounts or, some unique spells or something like that. Just enough to separate out the two of them and kind of make them feel a little bit unique there. All right, so we'll finish it out on Lords here, but before we get into it, we need to bring up one thing right in advance, and that's going to be balance. There's no two ways to get around this issue for single player. In multiplayer, any of the Chaos Demons are going to be powerful. There's no two ways around that, whether that's for the monogods or otherwise. In multiplayer, at least they can ratchet the ever-loving crap out of the individual cost of lords. In single player, though, that's not really a good balancing option. The one I could see for single player is perhaps either hiding them behind a right to unlock, like the Slan do for the Lizardmen, either hard capping them outright, like what the Tomb Kings have in their single player, or you know what, steal a page out of the modding book and put them at the end of the skills tree, like what the Skink Scribe had in that particular mod. There's a bunch of different options on the table, but they definitely can't just be the kind of one where you just recruit them whenever you feel like, because these things are going to be almost armies unto themselves, and that's true for all of the Chaos Demons. But with that said, we'll get into these ones. Full disclosure, I am stealing both of these from Malal's list, and GW, always being a fan of copywriting the ever-loving crap out of everything they do, they'd have to change the names around and stuff, I'm sure. But anyways, first up would be the Maiden of Malal, or Maiden of Malice, or just Maiden, or something copyrightable for GW. This would be your kind of infantry lord option for them. Um, wouldn't be as tanky as the other option that we'll get into in a sec, but would definitely still be a damage dealer. Would probably have your caster lord potential in there. And of course, you can always toss them up onto walls and the like for siege battles. But then, say you want something with a bit more staying power, well, that would lead you to your second lord option, being the Guardian of Contradictions. This would be a huge, monstrous unit, a very obvious target for things like artillery, siege towers, and archers to fire at. So, super high risk because, there's a very good chance that it'll be half dead by the time it gets into battle. But if it does get into battle, this thing will be an absolute wrecking ball on legs. Um, again, balance is probably going to be a little bit more powerful than what it's for the demons than what it is for others, but that can be planned around. And in case you're wondering why you would ever pick a maiden over a guardian of contradiction, there's a few reasons. One, I would imagine that the maiden would be a quicker unit of the two. Two, she would be able to absolutely shred enemy units, especially like dueling, whereas the guardian would be more for your anti-tar pits. And three, of course, with her being so small, you can hide her in forests, you can put her up on walls, you can get her protected, whereas that guardian is going to be a massive arrow and artillery magnet the second he sets foot on the battlefield. All right, so just before we wrap up, there is one little bonus topic that I would absolutely love to see addressed with the Chaos Undivided faction, these being the Chaos Gods of Law. So if you're unfamiliar, because this lore is absolutely ancient and abandoned, these were four chaotic entities that were essentially the exact opposites and rivals of the four monogods of chaos. We only know of three of them by name, but they've definitely got tendrils mixed in with everything we've just mentioned here. So, for example, we can start with Arianka. She was basically like the goddess of law, right? She was, if you really believed in, a fair place, you believed in her. Sinch actually ended up throwing her into a prison and trapping her underneath the city of Prague, or the capital of Kislev. Um, she's kind of mentioned to be the reason that the ice witches in Kislev even have their magic. But again, this could be a kind of interesting one. She was kind of abandoned after Malal was abandoned, but if you're going to throw in Zuvassin instead, there you go. There's your opportunity to get her back into the game. One of the other ones was Sulcan the Avenger. He was essentially good version of Korn, I guess is the best way to describe him. Also a psychotic, kill everything that moves kind of entity, but for some reason he was considered to be good. He was the rival entity to Korn from the good guy's side. Again, was abandoned when Malal was, but there's a few reasons why he could be a super interesting character to have in there too. But the last one, the one I think is actually most interesting, is one we've already had mentioned in Total War Warhammer already, which is Illuminas. If you've heard the Mages of Light or Light Wizards, I suppose I should say, in the games, sometimes they'll actually reference Illuminas, and that's because he is basically the god of light, if that makes any sense. He's the opposite of Nurgle. Um, again, super interesting possibility to really play around with the lore there and have some fun. Like I said, I mean, they are referenced by Be'lakor when he's talking to Archaon. He says that they don't exist, but Be'lakor is known to be a liar. There's some cool opportunities to have them go in there. Now, I don't think they're going to get their own armies or anything crazy like that. They're probably not going to be playable characters or nothing too crazy. But whether they can give some missions, whether they are mission objectives themselves. There's some cool opportunities to have some fun with these four. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this week. I do apologize that there was no mod video for last week. Unfortunately, these chaos videos tend to be mammoth time sinks. It takes a long time to go through army lists, takes a long time to go through source material, takes a long time to find all the imagery, to do all the recordings. They're huge time sinks. Probably won't do one for a little while as a result of how big of a time sink they are. But we'll get back to the normal schedule of things this coming week. Next off topic Tuesdays, we're going to be taking a look at how the gameplay and stuff in Game 3 needs to change as compared to the previous two games. So stay tuned for that. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.